I'm Michaela Weary, and I'm presenting on why we don't learn about the war on drugs and the racism of the Reagan presidency. First, I'll present you with my thesis. The racism of the Reagan presidency encouraged mass incarceration and institutionalized racism that we see today. Before I get into my reasoning, here's a quick definition from history.com of the war on drugs. Based on the definition given, you can see that this wasn't a new idea in America. Many reform movements, such as the temperance movement, had this same ideology. Now, the 13th Amendment is a really good amendment for freeing Black people and helping with Black codes, but it also has a negative side. This amendment was abused throughout history because of one word: crime. Though you couldn't legally enslave or oppress Black people, you could still enslave or incarcerate criminals. Now, who would we make these so-called criminals? Well, that's where the war on drugs and the racism of the Reagan presidency comes in. Now, from the late 20th century to now, you can see how racism isn't always as upfront as we think it was in the 1800s through 1960s. Well, why is that? Well, as President Reagan's strategist Atwater said on tape,
you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites.
So you're telling me that abstract language is specifically used to target some American populations? Yeah. It's called dog whistling, and it's used in modern American institutions. So when Black people notice this language and they're like, that's racist, people who tend to not understand are quick to say, well, why? I don't see. This whole idea of dog whistling or using, quote, abstract language to get the attention of some groups was popularized through Reagan's presidency, which was 30-something years ago. And it's barely noticed because maybe it doesn't sound or look as bad or racist as the 1800s, 50s, or 60s, but it's actually a lot worse. With this dog whistling strategy in mind, we can look back on the war on drugs and the astonishing amount of Black people who were incarcerated in result. Could it be that this war on drugs was actually a war on Black people? Was the whole crime clause of the 13th Amendment abused so we can put Black people in jail and label them as criminals for carrying these drugs so they can be incarcerated? Well, let's look through a brief history. The war on drugs was first coined by Nixon in his campaign in 1968. Then Reagan kind of declared that war in 1982. It can be argued that Nixon's drug war was focused mostly on public health relations. In the beginning, it kind of seemed that way, but then he slowly decided to focus on the, quote, criminal aspect of this. He was kind of saying that, what if we put these criminals who were selling drugs to our community in jail in mass numbers? In his 1971 speech, when Nixon first coined the term, it seemed like he just wanted to initially increase awareness and have strategies to eliminate this war on drugs. But the turning point was when Nixon decided to escalate law enforcement and try to, quote-unquote, end the war on drugs just for politics. In 1972, he made the Southern Strategy, which ultimately shifted the drug issue to a crime issue, hence the word crime from the 13th Amendment. From the 70s bringing us into the 80s, American politicians saw this fighting of the war on drugs to be a big deal. Nixon and state governments intensified the criminal justice system so that these criminals would be put in jail. Now let's bring us to Reagan's presidency, which lasted from 1981 to 1989, which was roughly only 31 years ago. Starting from 1986 with the Anti-Drug Act, Reagan put all these systems and laws in place to go against these criminals, and the bad guy gets chalked up and the good guy wins in the end. But was this really a good thing? This sneaky racism and dog whistling was used to criminalize and incarcerate mass amounts of Black people. Many have either died in jail or are still there. As for the institutionalized racism, this language is still used today, especially in housing. But it's also found in healthcare, education, and American politics in general. So why don't we learn about this stuff sooner? These are still systems that are used in America today. Is it because the 60s, 50s, and civil rights movement were just so easy to visualize? Why does the American education system choose what history is taught in regards to Black relations? Do we only focus on things like slavery and things in the 50s and 60s just because it's easier to visualize and conceptualize? Because we are given these images of people being lynched and all that stuff that's up front? What about the stuff that's institutionalized that are still in use today? To me personally, it only makes sense to teach what has influenced the modern day oppressive systems of Black people that can maybe contribute to how we can solve those systems. Of course, the war on drugs was not the exigence of all these issues, but it was a way that racism was really institutionalized and kept on the down low. Well, in 2020, I guess it's a trend to not be racist. So these racist corporations dog whistle and use these different languages and appease to the Black community when really they're just making things worse for us. This was influenced by this political system. To continue, we are still dealing with mass incarceration issues regarding the Black community as well. In conclusion, we should learn about the war on drugs and racism in the Reagan presidency, as well as the civil rights movement in schools, because it just gives you a glimpse on how institutionalized racism works and how you can see the language that's used in dog whistling today.